There's just something so amazing about water. The fact that it can cause great joy for us when we go to the beach with our family, but at the same time, there's a riskiness to water that makes us aware. If you ever take your family to the beach, you'll know that a day at the beach doesn't always mean that everything's good and that everything's easy. Having 4 kids of my own, anytime we go to the beach, it's this tension between this enjoyment of the water while at the same time making sure that everybody's okay. And especially if you go to the ocean, where there's so much about the ocean, there's such power in the waters, the waves and the riptides and all the creatures of the sea. And so although you're there for a day at the beach, there's this constant tension and wrestling match with enjoying what the water can provide for you, while at the same time making sure that everybody stays safe. In Luke chapter 8, we see that Jesus says to his disciples, "Let's go to the other side." And they get into the boat, and while they're headed to the other side, Jesus falls asleep, and the storm comes up, so much so that the waves begin to come over the boat. And his disciples go and they wake Jesus up. "Master, Master, we're going to drown." Now, I'm not exactly sure what it was that they were hoping Jesus would do, but I'm pretty certain by their response, they were surprised when he actually did something. Jesus got up and he says, "Why do you have such little faith?" And he spoke and rebuked the winds and the waves, and they listened to him. And then the disciples looked at each other in amazement, and they asked the question, "Who is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." Now, in order to understand why the disciples were so nervous, we really need to understand the biblical theme of water. And for that, we've got to go all the way back to Genesis chapter 1. And in Genesis 1, even before creation starts, God creates the heavens and the earth, but day 1 hasn't taken place yet. And it says that the earth was covered with the waters, the deep, and the Spirit of God hovered over the deep. In the ancient world, the waters represented chaos, this constant churning and tension. And all throughout the Old Testament, we see this theme of the waters and the chaos and the tension. And in the beginning, we have the waters of the deep covering the earth. And God speaks into the chaos and creates. From there, from the creation narrative, we move forward to the flood. And we see again that the waters have been built up in order to judge the world. And it says this in Genesis 8, that God remembered Noah. And he sends the winds to send the water where they're to go. You see, God speaks to the wind and the waves, and they obey him. Then we get to the people of Israel, and after 400 years of slavery, they cry out to God. And as they're crying out to God, God hears their cry and sends a deliverer. And Moses would come and confront the Pharaoh, and through that time, the people would be set free. And as they're even exiting, they have this water, this body of water that is stopping them from their freedom. And God tells the waters where to go, and they obey him. We see the same thing in the Jordan River when the people of Israel are about to enter into the promised land. They're about to finally get where they wanted to be all this time, but they have water that separates them from the promised land. And so God stops the waters. And it was during flood season. He tells the waters where to go, and they listen to him. In the Psalms, we see that God often is talking about the waters and these chaotic tensions that exist. And in Psalms, it says that God stores the waters into jars. He puts the deep into storehouses. What this is a statement of control. That even though there's chaos all around us, even though everything seems like it's out of control, that God has such control over the chaos that he can even put it into jars, that he can even store it away, that he just puts it on a shelf. You see, God has always been in control of the chaos. God has always been in control of the waters. And what we need to start to recognize is that even in the world that seems like the waters are stirring back up, even in a place where there's the tension of the sea, where this chaos just keeps rising up, that God is in control of the chaos. So now fast forwarding to the disciples, when they begin to look at each other in amazement and ask, "Who is this?" He commands the winds and the waves, and they obey him. It says, in fear and amazement, they asked one another. Why were they afraid? The disciples had seen so many other miracles from Jesus up to this point, but none of them terrified them. You see, what happened was in that moment, they started to remember the waters. They started to remember the tension of the sea and the chaos that it represented. They started to go back to the pre-creative waters. They looked at the Exodus event and how God told the waters where to go. They looked at the Jordan. They remembered the Psalms. And in that moment, they asked themselves, who is this that's in the boat with us right now? You see, Jesus told the wind and the waves where to go, and they obeyed him. The disciples went from fear of the storm to fear of the realization of who had the ability to tell the wind and the waves where to go, and even they would obey them. Often in this Luke passage, we apply this now as Jesus is in control of the storms of our lives, but it's so much bigger than that, so much greater than that. He's not just in control of the storms in our lives, he's in control of all things. This is a cosmic recognition that the one that the disciples were in the boat with, he controls the wind and the waves. He tells the sea where to go. He stores it up in jars and puts it into storehouses. In this time of chaos, in this time of confusion, in this time of uncertainty, the one thing that we can be certain about is we know who was in the boat that day. And the one who was in the boat that day was the one who was able to tell the wind and the waves where to go, and even they would obey.